Welcome to another episode, all. Throughout this episode, we are going to watch a video by Sabine Hossenfelder, someone who's meant to be a theoretical physicist, but her research seems very pathetic. She did a video called Why Is Everyone Suddenly Neurodivergent? And it didn't begin with this. She even did one, Is Being Trans a Social Fad Among Teenagers? She seems to be putting her feet in places where they don't belong, and things that she doesn't even know about. So we're going to go through this video and correct it all, and find out, is she just being a liar, is she a bigot, or is she just pathetic at research? Let's get started.
In 2003, Simon Baron-Cohen, a clinical psychologist at the University of Cambridge, claimed that Albert Einstein had autism. Elon Musk has said he has Asperger's syndrome, and if you ask Google, you'll find many lists of famous people who supposedly have autism, usually with the preamble, though he was never diagnosed. It's been attributed to Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Eminem, none of whom ever said anything to deny or confirm it. What's going on? Why does everyone suddenly have autism? How is it different from Asperger's syndrome? What does neurodivergent mean? And what is internalized ableism? Am I autistic? That's what we'll talk about today. First things first, what is autism?
The first answer is we simply don't know, because the autism research has not been about trying to identify autism. It's always been about trying to eradicate it. It's always been based upon an ableist framework, which has led to lots of delusional conclusions throughout its history, such as the vaccinations, such as the refrigerator mother theory, the triad of impairments, and so on. So many things which have been debunked. I'll include an article in the description that shows how many have been debunked. So make sure you have a read of it if you have the time. So remember, we simply don't know.
The term autism was introduced in 1911 by the Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. He used it to describe what he believed to be a childhood version of schizophrenia. The term autism alludes to the Greek word autos, which means self, a word that Bleuler used because the children seemed to be detached from reality and withdrawn into their inner world, even though they didn't have smartphones back then. Autism was later recognized as a condition independent from schizophrenia. Today, the diagnosis of autism includes learning difficulties, especially with language and speech, trouble with verbal and nonverbal communication, avoiding eye contact, repetitive movements, specialized and often obsessive interests or behaviors, difficulties with emotional control, and extreme reactions to stimuli, such as light, touch, or noise. Autistic people also sometimes have unusual abilities, such as a remarkable memory for facts, numbers, or visual details, or doing mental arithmetic. This combination of cognitive problems and abilities is the reason why some autistic people were once regarded idiots savants. However, the word idiot has drifted in meaning since then and is now considered an insult, so the condition has been named to savant syndrome. Most people had probably never heard of autism until Dustin Hoffman introduced it to the world in 1988 with the movie Rain Man.
The movie Rain Man is not what brought people to seeing autism. It's not why people didn't know about it. The reason people didn't know about it is because it's no longer what it originally was. In their ableist research, they have persistently shifted the meaning. One point it was called Connor syndrome, another point child integration syndrome, another point Asperger's syndrome, another point pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and at another point autism spectrum disorder. They've persistently shifted the meaning. At first it was all about refrigerator mothers, and it became the triad of impairments. And now we're just in more dogmatic assumptions on ableism, which is leading us down negative paths. But fortunately, there is some people doing good research in autism. I'll talk a bit more about that later.
The movie was inspired by Kim Peek, one of the most famous savants ever. But, plot twist, while Peek had originally been diagnosed with autism, in 2008, a group of doctors studied MRI images of his brain and concluded that he wasn't autistic, but most likely had FG syndrome, a genetic condition linked to abnormalities of the X chromosome. In 1943, the Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger described a group of children who had difficulties with social interactions and communication, like autistic people, but who did not have the same troubles with language and cognitive function. This high function.
First of all, that's been debunked. There's individuals with Asperger's syndrome who did have the speech problems. Temple Grandin as an example. She didn't begin speaking until a late age. And she was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So that's just another false claim being made there.
Functioning autism became later called Asperger's syndrome. Fast forward 70 years, and psychologists decided that there is no clear distinction between Asperger's syndrome and autism, and the term high-functioning autism is neither useful nor descriptive. Instead, there is an entire spectrum of symptoms with expressions that greatly vary. This is why the term Asperger's syndrome is no longer in use today.
There's another reason why it's not in use today. During the 21st century, some documents were found by Hans Asperger that showed he was part of the Nazi Holocaust, but he was actually a participant in the disability genocide program and supported racial hygiene. In other words, the claim that people with dark skin are an official disease, are subhumans. Hold on to those things for a moment.
It's now called autism spectrum disorder, ASD for short. ASD subsumes both Asperger's syndrome, autism, and some other developmental disorders. Why Elon Musk referred to a retired expression like Asperger's is anyone's guess. Maybe he spends too much time with this old paper app called Twitter.
No, that's not why. Some people still go by the term Asperger's because that's what they were diagnosed with. It is still on their medical record, even though it is no longer used in the medical system, depending which country you're in. As some countries, the medical system does still go by Asperger's. It's not in every country that this applies.
Besides the previously mentioned difficulties with language, social interactions, emotional control, and repetitive behavior, studies have found that ASD is correlated with anxiety, sleep problems, seizures, and an elevated risk of gastrointestinal problems.
Actually, no. This is not. This is entirely false. Most of these things actually saying by autism are actually by something called the microbiome. There's some great research going on right now on the microbiome, which is showing that there's a stronger relationship between the immune system, the bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, and with the brain, or gut-brain axis. When they treat the bacteria inside the microbiome, it seems to alleviate so many of these symptoms, such as speech problems, showing that the speech problems are more of the gut problem. But since not all autistic people have gut problems, such as myself, we know that autism is not a gut problem. So what is autism? And as I said at the beginning, we don't know. But this does sound like some promising research alleviating all the symptoms that make life harder.
Symptoms of ASD are usually diagnosed in early childhood and persist throughout life, though they can improve or get worse. The spectrum of the disorder does not refer to the strength of symptoms, but rather their variety. How strong the symptoms are is measured separately by 3 different levels.
Actually, no, they're not. I'll get back to that in a moment.
Which indicate how much support the person needs.
Notice of how they just said, indicate how much support the person needs. She just said beforehand it's to do with severity. No, Level 1, 2, and 3 has nothing to do with severity, and this is why you find us saying there's no such thing as severe autism. Autism is a developmental disability. Something can't be static and developmental at the same time. Since it's developmental, that means it changes, and she confessed the symptoms can get better or worse as time goes by, showing that you might not need as much help when you get older, so you might go from level 3 to level 2 autism. You think it might get worse, so you might shift from level 1 autism to level 3 autism. You know, you can fluctuate between them. It's developmental. So, no, it's not severity level, it's just a level of support needs.
One is the lowest level, 3 the highest. Of course, no one likes to use a clunky term like autism spectrum disorder, which is why most people still refer to it as just autism. To avoid confusion.
No, we don't just refer to it as just autism because people don't like autism spectrum disorder. Don't you think autism spectrum disorder is a waste of breath? You know, why not just say autism? It's much easier. You know, people don't say classical autism. You know, everyone just goes by autism. Plus disorders, and it is an inappropriate term for it.
Confusion, what was previously called autism is now often called classical autism. The other expression that has taken hold for having autism spectrum disorder is being on the spectrum, though I now think they should have called it quantum autism. Several studies have shown that the brains of children with ASD develop differently than those of most children, and that this difference is often visible in brain scans before the onset of symptoms. For example, a 2017 paper in Nature found that in ASD children, some parts of the brain grow noticeably faster than average, and that this...
Actually, no, this is not entirely accurate, because even though we do these brain scans, we tend to get different results with different children. Each child seems to give a various result. Allow me to read to you from PhD Thomas Armstrong's book, The Power of Neurodiversity, a little bit about some of these brain differences that Sabine seems not to know about. I quote, "There is still a great deal about autism that we don't understand. Because of their strong interest in visual spatial pursuits, we might regard autistic individuals as right-brained learners. On the other hand, it also seems as if the gifts and abilities of autism have a lot to do with back brain functions. Noted neurosurgeon Carl Pribram has pointed out that posterior back areas of the brain have to do with the objective world, while the anterior frontal areas of the brain are concerned with the narrative world, self and other. Since we've seen that autistic people show their greatest strengths relating to objects and their greatest weaknesses relating to self and others, it would seem that they are both back-brained and right-brained. Many of their difficulties arise from having to perform in a front-brained and left-brained world. If the world were different and social interaction were regarded as a splinter skill, intelligence, perhaps we wouldn't even have a disability category for autism. But even though we don't live in such a world, knowing about the strengths, talents, and abilities of autistic people builds a strong case for a new level of respect and understanding for those who function along the remoter regions of the sociability continuum." And remember where I mentioned spatial skills, where I mentioned. I'm just going to read out another. I quote, "As we noted earlier, autistic individuals perform much better at tests that involve visual spatial tasks, such as block design and embedded figures. There are even suggestions that when the interpersonal and language demands are removed from intelligence tests, and the focus is on reasoning based on pictures, such as is the case, for example, in the Raven Standard Progressive Matrices intelligence tests, IQ scores of autistic children increase from 30 to 70 percentile points compared with testing on the Wechsler intelligence scale for children. This is a research finding that could potentially let many individuals diagnosed with autism out of the ranks of intellectually disabled. A recent study, in fact, suggests that autistics are actually 40% faster at the kind of problem solving done on the Ravens test compared with non-autistics. The lead researcher, Isabelle Soloyer, notes, some critics argued that autistics would be unable to complete the RSPM because of its complexity. Yet our study shows autistics complete it as efficiently and have a more highly developed perception than non-autistics. End of quote. So, findings show that autistic people have an even bigger and even better perception of it, and by using the back of the brain more, that's where perception is. So it all makes sense. Let's continue.
This growth is linked to the severity of social difficulties. Other studies have shown that compared to the average person, people with ASD have significantly fewer connections between parts of the brain that are used for social interactions, and instead more local connections in regions associated with sensory control. These properties can be inferred from brain scans before the age of 2. How common is autism spectrum disorder? The worldwide prevalence of ASD is about 1%, but in high-income countries, some estimates say the rate is higher. For example, a 2018 review by researchers from the UK found that ASD prevalence in England and North America is between 2.4 and almost 10%, depending on region. According to the American Center for Disease Control, about 1 in 36 children in the United States were diagnosed with ASD in 2020. Probably quite a few of you who are watching this video are autistic. I'm afraid I have nothing whatsoever new to tell you. The number for ASD diagnoses has increased substantially over the past 2 decades. In 2000, it was only 1 in 150 children who were diagnosed in the US. This means the number has increased by almost a factor of 5 in 20 years.
No, it hasn't. What has caused all this big increase is variation and changes to the diagnostic criteria and of how the psychiatrists and researchers have persistently shifted the meaning of what autism even is. Allow me to give a quick timeline through it. At first, in 1943, when it was the DSM-2, only the individuals Leo O'Connor spoke about, the ones who can't talk, the ones who are intellectually disabled, only they could be diagnosed as autistic. And as we got to the DSM-3 in 1952, around that time, they added to it PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, because that way they could diagnose kids who were over 2.5 years old. Beforehand, if you were over 2.5 years old, you could not be diagnosed with autism, so the rates were much lower. In the history of science, which Sabine here fails to mention, which we'll cover a bit more later, is they believed that autism was a boy's condition, which it should explain to you the Autism Speaks Blue jigsaw piece that they held on to until 2020. When we get to the DSM-4 around 1980, when it was the DSM-3 being revised, what happened was that's when Lorna Wing, who Sabina doesn't seem to mention in this video, she managed to get the pictures of Hans Asperger, and that's when his works were found. Because Lorna Wing had a husband who can translate German, so he translated the papers and they found Hans Asperger's reports. Lorna Wing then worked with the American Psychological Association, and they decided to add Asperger syndrome in 1994. And if you look at a graph, you'll see that in 1994, when they added Asperger syndrome, people like me, that's when the rates began to skyrocket. Beforehand, in 1943, it was only 1 in 10,000 people are autistic. But just by shifting the meaning of it bit by bit, they were able to diagnose more. And this is part of what's called the autism industrial complex, where anyone can capitalize on autism. in this case autistic people. The more they diagnose, the more intervention they can sell. The more diagnosed, the more research they get paid to do. The more money they make out of it as they diagnose more people. Such as there's the rates of the LGBTQ community and autistic people, but while autistic people have persistently increased, so much money has gone towards autism research, but not much research has gone towards LGBTQ. So I'm showing that they're putting more towards autism and less towards others. Now, let's continue.
The increase in the UK has been even faster, almost a factor 8 in the same period. The major reason for this is higher awareness and better screening. At the same time, the fraction of those severely affected by ASD is dropping. In the 1980s, more than 2/3 of people diagnosed with autism also had an intellectual disability. By 2018, the fraction of ASD children in the US classified with an intellectual disability, that's an IQ below 70, was 31%. This decrease...
Actually, no, this decrease and so on is not to do with any of this stuff that Sabine has to say. It's the fact that they've slotted intellectual disability under autism spectrum disorder. As intellectual disability rates are going down, autism spectrum rates are going even further up. What they've basically done is slotted too many disorders, disabilities, comorbidities under one umbrella, that they're all tangled up now. Such as, do you remember that big circle of bubbles that she showed earlier in the video? With lots of different things inside. They've slotted it all together.
Increase of the fraction of those with severe disability is also likely due to the enhanced awareness and screening, which picks up on the less obvious cases. At the moment, there are about 4 times more men than women diagnosed with ASD. The reasons for this are not well understood.
They're very well understood. The reason we know is because all the way back in the day, all the autism research was based on boys, as it was believed to be a boys' condition. Yeah, so the diagnostic criteria is gender biased, which does not work in favour of females. And as a result of this, lots of females have been misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And that's why the rates of borderline personality disorder go up as well.
Several studies have shown that young girls are less likely to be diagnosed with ASD because they're better at hiding symptoms, a strategy that's referred to as masking. Masking includes copying facial expressions and social behavior, or memorizing a repertoire of answers to questions that'll be accepted as normal enough. While masking might help girls with social integration, it can cause other mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. In later life, ASD in girls might get covered up by conditions such as eating disorders or OCD. Girls might also be more successful at masking because their social environment makes it easier. For example, a 2017 paper by American researchers observed 96 elementary school children, half of which with ASD. They found that ASD girls weaved in and out of social activities in loose groups, making it hard for anyone to tell whether they integrated well. Boys, on the other hand, tended to play organized games, and the ASD boys just played alone, so they stood out much more obviously. How much of the sex difference in ASD diagnosis is due to masking is presently unclear. What is clear, however, is that diagnosing girls requires other methods than those used for boys. ASD is normally diagnosed in childhood below the age of 5, especially now that doctors look for symptoms during regular childhood screening. However, this is a fairly recent development. The increasing awareness of the condition has also resulted in larger numbers of people being diagnosed later in life because they fell through the cracks as children. Still, it can take a long time, sometimes years, to get a diagnosis. It's a problem because the lack of diagnosis can make it more difficult to cope. A study done in the UK estimated that 10% of suicide victims had signs of undiagnosed autism. What causes it? Physical autism was originally believed to be a psychological condition that results from poor parenting. This idea was pushed in particular by the psychiatrist Leo Kanner. He argued that the leading cause of autism was the refrigerator mother who didn't love her child as she should have. We now know that ASD is not the fault of maternal temperatures, but an unusual variation of neurodevelopment with a strong hereditary component. That is,
not actually due to a very unusual variation of neurodevelopment. Your neurodevelopment is dependent upon the environment or the signals that you're experiencing. So when you were inside your mother's womb was your environment. So whatever your mother was experiencing, that was influencing your brain development, your brain structure. So our brains are actually already being structured while we're inside the womb. The development's already occurring. So it's more to do with what's happening on the outside, what's been done to our genes.
Children of people with ASD are considerably more likely to also have it. Different studies have put the probability at about 40 to 80%. Part of the difficulty of pinning the number down is that ASD has so many different facets, there are loads of genes involved, and quite possibly some aspects of it are more, others less hereditary. Some environmental factors also seem to play a role. For example, some studies have found a link between obesity or diabetes of the mother and ASD of the child. Though the increase in the odds ratio is not large, and as it's often the case with studies like this, it's difficult to infer causation from a correlation because there could be underlying causes linking both. A 2016 meta-analysis by a group of Chinese researchers looked at the link between the age of the parents and the chance of the child to have ASD. They took into account 27 studies with a total of almost 67,000 cases and found a clear correlation, especially with the age of the father. Per every increase of 10 years in maternal and paternal age, they found an associated 18% and 21% higher risk of ASD, respectively. We've also learned about a few things that do not cause it, other than cold mums. For example, vaccines. In 1998, an anti-vaccine activist managed to publish a fraudulent paper in The Lancet claiming that measles vaccines cause autism. He was struck off the medical register and the paper was retracted. If you're watching this channel, you probably don't need to be told, but vaccines don't cause autism. They don't cause autism spectrum disorder either. To name just one example, a 2014 meta-analysis summarized 10 different studies and found no evidence of a relation between vaccination and ASD.
They shouldn't have even required any research anywhere, because autism has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. We already knew that. That was something that we already knew before this vaccination thing was made. So whatever causes autism existed well before any vaccinations existed. So we know that the cause was not vaccines, because vaccines didn't exist. So that shouldn't have taken a lot of testing.
Other things that don't cause ASD are cesarean sections, in vitro fertilization, plastic wrappers, bacterial infections, and watching YouTube. ASD is the lifelong.
I would just like to point out, keep in mind there's things like the bacteria, the bacterial pollutants and so on that you mentioned, because she's going to bring up an article later in this video where these are the very things which are getting described as pseudoscience, and she chooses to go by that.
Lifelong condition. There's no cure and there's no medication. However, early diagnosis and intervention with suitably targeted programs can greatly improve life satisfaction, and medication as well as psychotherapy can be used to deal with some of the symptoms. Currently, the treatment focus is on psychological and social support for ASD children and their families. Some young autistic people don't speak at all and can benefit from using picture cards or speech-generating devices. Targeted programs that are started as early as possible can improve attention, language development, social engagement, and can reduce the severity of symptoms later in life.
Now, what we have seen is that there's investigations where during the pandemic COVID-19, when autistic children moved from school, transitioned to home learning, what we came to find was now that they were in an environment that nurtured them for their needs, that their needs were being addressed, they flourished and developed. And that's the way all organisms tend to work. If they're in environments that suit their needs, they develop healthily. The very genes associated with autism are also inside of other wildlife. So why don't we find all this autism stuff inside wildlife very regularly? It's obviously something to do with the difference between the way humans are and the way animals are.
The most successful of these programs are those which include parents and schools, because much of it comes down to other people understanding triggers and trying to avoid them. For example, children with ASD might be bad at rapidly switching between tasks or be unable to read nonverbal clues, both of which can be avoided to a large degree. They also often use repetitive motion, such as rocking or hand flapping, to calm themselves down, a behavior referred to as stimming. Asking them to stop is exactly the wrong thing to do. Those are some examples where awareness among other people can really make a big difference.
This shows that autistic people are the ones who know better. We were saying all along, just let us stim. Just let us do what we need to do. We're doing it because we feel the need to, and so on. But you kept stopping us, forcing us to stop doing it, and that only made things worse, showing that we did know better.
There are also some medications to treat co-occurring symptoms like irritability, agitation, anxiety, or depression, and some might benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy. However, there is no one-size-fits-all approach because the symptoms of ASD are so varied. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, autism spectrum disorder is a mental health disorder.
Now, according to the DSM-5 TR, it's a developmental disorder. Yeah, you see me there, I usually call it a disability, but in the DSM-5, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. That's how they phrase it in the DSM-5, not a mental health disorder. So she couldn't have researched very well to think it's a mental health disorder, especially when hospital websites and so on all say it's no kind of mental illness.
However, a lot of people with ASD and other conditions that have traditionally been labeled disorders feel that description is inappropriate. Just because they're not typical doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. The term that many of them prefer is that they are neurodiverse as opposed to neurotypical. The term neurodiverse refers to a group, whereas an individual would be described as neurodivergent. Neurodiversity includes not just ASD, but also attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, and a few other conditions. The term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1990s by the Australian sociologist Judy Singer, loosely based on the expression biodiversity. She saw it as an extension of social justice movements that had given women and homosexuals rights they should have had all along. Singer argued that neurodivergent people had not been given their rightful place in society either, and it was about time to stop pathologizing them.
Right, time to pause and talk about the political side, as that's the part we're moving into now. I would like to show you something first. You actually demonized, autistic people, homosexuals, women, were all demonized in the racist eugenics movement of the 19th century. For example, biological racism came up. Allow me to read to you from the Darwin Effect. This was around the time when evolution was coming into science. I quote, "Biological racism as we know it today did not exist throughout most of history. Racism has a surprisingly recent origin and parallels the rise of evolutionary thought. At the earliest, it can be traced back to the Renaissance. This chapter documents the importance of Darwinism in producing the concept of biological race and along with it, the racism and strife that has flourished in America and elsewhere for the last 2 centuries. If all races were equally fit, as indeed they are, evolution could not occur, because whether or not a particular race survived would depend on chance, not the alleged superiority of the race. Race is not a biological, but a sociological construct. End of quote. So, first of all, racism, a social construct. It is socially constructed. If you allow me to go to the women's section. I quote, a review of the prominent late 19th century writings reveals that a major plank of early evolution theory was the belief that women were intellectually and physically inferior to men. Female inferiority was a logical conclusion of the Darwinian worldview, because males were believed to be exposed to far greater selective pressures than females, especially in war, competition for mates, food, and clothing. Conversely, women were protected from selection by norms that required adult males to provide for and protect women and children. Darwin is taught that, as a result of this protection, natural selection operated far more actively on males than on females. As a result, males became more evolved than women and more superior in virtually all intellectual and skill areas. The women inferiority doctrine is an excellent example of the fact that armchair logic often has been more important in building Darwinian theory than fossil and other empirical evidence. End of quote. So, you see, from the eugenics movement, homosexuality, LGBTQ, left-handedness were placed in the DSM as pathological disorders. They were pathologized, ostracized. The female inferiority doctrine from the racist eugenics movement, general racism towards different races, when originally humanity is just one race, but you've divided us with the concept of normality. So we see that all the discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism originates from normality. Your ideology that there's a normal, ideal brain that everyone needs to fit. And now, when we go on to politics, in pathology, we've got typical brains and atypical brains. And in the neurodiversity movement, we've got neurotypical brains and neurodivergent brains. Both fields are parallel because both were political movements. So in the 19th and early 20th century, you did a political movement that caused social injustices, and the neurodiversity movement is more to do with justifying your social injustices of the eugenics movement. Now, I'm going to read from the autistic community and the neurodiversity movement now of what it is, because the eugenics movement, we can see it was trying to eliminate genes. It was trying to eliminate biological differences, is what we can see in there. Right. I quote, the Exploring Diagnosis Project research inquires into how diagnosis catalyzes mobilization, focusing on autistic adults and the neurodiversity movement. The project aimed to assess what the understandings of neurodiversity are among autistic adults. Ginny Russell, the project lead, and I conducted a thematic analysis of autistic adults' responses to the question, what is neurodiversity in your own words? From a study I co-led with Kristen Gillespie Lynch, Russell and I found that the data largely mapped onto definitions autistic adults in the movement have given, defining the NDM as encompassing both human biological differences in cognition, brains, and genes, while also serving as an activist tool for change toward acceptance and inclusion of autistic and other neurodivergent people. Responses describe neurodivergent people as socially oppressed and stigmatized, yet possessing valuable differences should not be cured, but instead supported with rights and accommodations. End of quote. The first book which I quoted, by PhD Thomas Armstrong, he went sharing about abilities and so on of people with autism. And they just pointed out valuable differences they could see in neurodivergent people, those who participated in that project. While the eugenics movement was reducing biological differences, the neurodiversity movement there is enhancing biological differences, bringing acceptance. So, really, the neurodiversity movement is oppositional to the racist eugenics movement. Altogether, that's what the neurodiversity movement is. It is a social justice movement for the social injustices caused by so-called normal people. Let's continue.
The neurodiversity movement weaved together with the American social justice movement and developed an extremist part. By 2013, some neurodiversity advocates wrote that autism and ADHD are the result of normal natural variation in the human genome. By
Actually, yes, that is entirely true. It is normal for there to be natural variation in the human. Variation is the rule between all humans. Even identical twins have variation between them. No two humans are identical. All humans are natural. There's variation between all humans, including genes, meaning it is natural variation. Since it's every human, it's normal natural variation.
2019, some said that the real problem is the dominant ableist culture of society that sets standards for what it means to be normal. An ableist is someone who believes that typical abilities are superior. If you're neurodivergent,
as I just mentioned about the purpose of the eugenics movement, it was about producing the most superior race, the most superior humans. So that's even a confession right there. You know, why would someone think typical abilities are superior? The remains and results of the eugenics movement.
Have internalized ableism, you may mistakenly blame yourself for the challenges you face, when in fact the problem lies with the societal barriers and discrimination that make it harder for neurodivergent people to thrive. Some of them have put the idea of treating autism on the same level as the idea of treating homosexuality. For example,
actually, no, we haven't. This is a big allegation that those who try to misrepresent the neurodiversity movement make. We have pointed out what I've just pointed out, that homosexuals were stigmatized socially, social injustice, women were stigmatized, social injustice, left-handed people were stigmatized, social injustice, and we're saying it's the same thing with autism. But you've simply done the same to autism, and we should unstigmatize it rather than leave it stigmatized. We should justify it and bring it to social justice. Just like homosexuality was brought to social justice. Just like women are still in the process of being brought to social justice. Just like races are still in the process of being brought to justice. The same, we should do the same for disabled people. Not view disabilities as the same way we view homosexuality.
Example, Autism Speaks is a charitable organization with the stated goal of creating an inclusive world for all individuals with autism throughout their lifespan.
Actually, no, that is not what they intend to do, and this will be shown in the next part.
He partnered with Google on a project called Missing to develop a database to identify genetic variants of autism. On their website, they described the project's mission as to identify many subtypes of autism with the goal of developing more personalized and effective treatments. 2 years ago, the project was decried by some people on Twitter as eugenics, the Nazi doctrine of cleaning society from genetically inferior groups, which back then included disabled and autistic people.
This makes it seem like Sabine is claiming that eugenics is a Nazi. It was a Nazi thing, that only the Nazis did it. It was worldwide. It actually began in America. You know, Francis Galton from Britain, he's the one who repopularized the eugenics, brought up the word which means well-born. Then he influenced the Americans. The Americans began the eugenics movement. And Adolf Hitler and the Germans were greatly influenced by Adolf Hitler as it became worldwide eugenics. And it was an entire scientific inquiry altogether. But the Nazis performed eugenicist genocide. It wasn't all of them performing genocide. So no, they're not claiming this is the Nazi doctrine. They claim it's simply eugenics because when it involves genes and you're causing genetic treatments, the only kind of genetic treatment is looking for biomarkers so you can abort people, as they're doing to those with Down syndrome. That is eugenics. That is selective, artificial selection, not natural selection.
It seems to me that these tweets attacking the missing project were severely misrepresenting what the project website stated. Nevertheless, Autism Speaks, which I remind you is a charitable organization that...
A charitable organization. And it has been labelled a hate group. I wonder why it's been labelled a hate group. Let's see. Do you really think it's because of just one project? Allow me to turn over. This is the founder of Autism Speaks. Hear what she had to say. Oh, is that really charitable, wanting to murder your own daughter? I would say certainly not. They have persistently fought against the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. Why are they fighting against autistic people if they want to help autistic people? I mentioned the Autism industrial complex of making money out of it. And what did that video just share? They're doing it for your money. They're restarting to sell t-shirts, and it says on their t-shirts, autism prevention. That is eugenics.
That supports autistic people has been labeled a hate group by some activists. This extreme position seems to be held by a small group that is vocal on Twitter, and I don't think it's representative for the neurodiversity community as a whole, but it's clearly a sentiment that exists. Fast forward to 2023, and TikTok is full of teenagers celebrating their neurodiversity, some of them self-diagnosed. Now, you might say there's nothing wrong with teenagers wanting to feel good about themselves, and I fully agree. The neurodiversity movement has a point. Our world is built for typical people, and typical people are often not mindful of those who are less typical. In most cases, I think not so much because typical people are actively mean, but passively careless.
Actually, no. Sabine, so-called typical people always have been actively mean, which is why it's always been so hypocritical to make the stereotype autistics have a lack of empathy. Let's take a look at your socially significant behaviours. Have you ever considered that there reason those as autistic don't accept your perspectives are because we perceive them as so immoral. Like, during the last 2 centuries, was the eugenics movement socially significant? Yes. Was slavery socially significant? Yes. Was racism socially significant? Yes. Was sexism socially significant? Yes. Was no gay marriage socially significant? Yes. Was disability discrimination socially significant? Yes. Was bullying socially significant? Yes. All these immoral norms, Sabina, give away that so-called social norms are inherently immoral, inherently mean. Even when hunting women down, accusing them as being witches, and you burn them at the stakes. You claim that black people are still apes as recently as the 90s. You did that actively. That is actively mean. The autistic people are saying to accept the black people by expanding biological differences. But you lot said the opposite. Since it was normal to be so-called white, you thought, oh, it's socially significant to be white, but socially insignificant to be the opposite. You lot are so obsessed with your social norms. So no, not passively careless, actively mean. Especially illustrated by double empathy of how you immediately cast us off within seconds just because we don't meet your expectations.
If you're too tall or too short, too loud or too quiet or too anything really, you'll have trouble fitting in. Some people's brains don't work like yours, but that doesn't mean they are the problem. The problem might be that you're not making the necessary effort trying to understand them. Paying attention to those outside a standard deviation of the average makes their lives easier and enriches our society. That sounds all well and good. Problem is that most neurodivergent people you see on TikTok are those well enough to produce TikToks. And in contrast to being queer or female, ASD can in severe cases significantly impair a person's ability to live independently.
No. As I've been pointing out, this is the microbiome that is causing these problems, not the autism. Oh, you're very behind in research, Sabina. You either are just a pathetic researcher or an intentionally dishonest woman. You must be one or the other. And the reason those on TikTok are the ones you say, can live independently, that doesn't mean they've got no difficulties. Where you go claiming, oh, we've got deficits and so on. Well, what about your deficits? Basically, when you say, oh, but your brain causes you so many difficulties, and so on. Well, so does your brain. Everyone's brains cause them difficulties. Not just ours. Everyone's genes cause people inferior traits. Like, it's an inferior trait to be bald. Because when you lose your hair, you're more susceptible to the sun's radiation, but it can cause you sun cancer right on your scalp. So that's an inferior gene, but you don't pathologize it, do you? But you chose to pathologize us.
Independently. This is why the neurodiversity movement has seen somewhat of a backlash in recent years, primarily from caregivers of people with level 3 ASD.
Oh, we're going back again onto caregivers. This illustrates that autistic people are right, especially the ASD3 who type, when they say, this is not about me. It's about my frigging parents. They don't care about what I see as quality of life. They impose their quality of life upon me. They don't allow me to have the life I want. So it's not about the autistic kids. These parents of ASD3 kids are just plain selfish. and want the child they expected.
Who feel like talking about internalized ableism doesn't help. For example, the London-based neurobiologist Moab Constandi has written an article for Aeon titled Against Neurodiversity, in which he draws attention to a worrying trend of romanticizing autism that has extended to other conditions that can be severe.
Actually, no, there's no romanticizing going on. The romanticizing was done during the eugenics movement. You romanticized yourselves. You are the ones who romanticized your deficits as normal, and you demonized ours. So now we're basically, the neurodiversity movement is pushing and saying to you, we are not demons. We are humans just like you. Doesn't every human have a combination of difficulties and strengths? Isn't that every human? So why shouldn't we have difficulties? So you're going by the logical fallacy here of a bandwagon. The bandwagon fallacy. Think that just because something's the majority, that means it's the right way. Oh. No, as we've just pointed out, the social norms, disability discrimination, was that righteous? It was the norm. It was the majority doing it. So was it moral? Was it right? No.
Debilitating and life-threatening, such as depression and schizophrenia. He writes that the idea that autism is a variation of normal is at odds with scientific understanding of the condition.
Actually, no. I'm just going to turn back to one of the books. Because in order to be able to define normal, you've got to be able to differentiate it from an opposite. So in order to call something an abnormality, you need to be able to define what's normal. But no one seems able to define normal. I'm going to quote the problematic part of your quantitative part. The Human Genome Project is founded upon a fallacy. There is no such thing as the human genome. Neither in space nor in time can such a definite object be defined. At hundreds of different loci, scattered throughout the 23 chromosomes, there are genes that differ from person to person. Nobody can say that blood group A is normal and OB and AB are abnormal. So when the Human Genome Project publishes the sequence of the typical human being, what will it publish for the ABO gene on chromosome 9? The project's declared aim is to publish the average or consensus sequence of 200 different people. But this would miss the point in the case of the ABO gene, because it is a crucial part of its function that it should not be the same in everybody. Variation is an inherent and integral part of the human, or indeed any genome. The genes that have been examined in the course of this book have been associated with specific disabilities, yet this is just to say that they have been found on average, more often in those with a particular diagnosis. The fallacy here is to identify the ADHD gene or schizophrenic genes, when we really don't even know what the mechanisms of these genes are in creating proteins that relate to specific psychiatric conditions. And the fact that so-called normal people have these genes too makes the task of identifying abnormal genes that much more difficult. Close quote. So if these genes that are in so-called normal people as well, what's wrong with them being inside of us? Precisely nothing. This is another form of ableism, like claiming your genes are better than ours, and so on. When science shows that mutations must occur in order for evolution to occur. They've gotten too carried away with quantitative data and lost interest in qualitative research. So, don't we deserve our rights? Because human autonomy is a human right, but not just a right, but a human need. Human autonomy is. When we look at the Feminine Boy Project, disallowing a feminine boy to be feminine, that resulted in suicide. When we look at gay conversion therapy, disallowing gay people to be gay, it resulted in suicide. When we look at applied behavior analysis, disallowing autistic kids to be autistic, it resulted in suicide. So it's safe to say that autonomy, if an individual doesn't have autonomy, control of their own life, that possibly is one of the big causes of suicide.
And that in their zealous pursuit of autistic rights, some advocates have become authoritarian and militant, harassing and bullying anyone who dares to portray autism negatively or expresses a desire for treatment or cure.
Tom Clements. Tom Clements owns the autistic dark web. They are absolute bullies all over social media. They are. And to claim that we're the militant ones, the neurodiversity advocates, and we're the ones doing rational science. We're bullies for doing actual science, which does not include personal points of view. And we're bullies because we're saying no, because we're just not giving you your way. You lot don't seem to realise that what you're actually suggesting is premature extinction. If you just allow me to turn back to the book, I'll see if I can find the page for it. It should be close to here. Yeah, here it is. I quote, even a person who has certain traits, such as below average intellect, may in some other way be genetically superior, a determination that we cannot make until all of the estimated 23,000 genes are mapped and compared to the entire population. And even then, comparative judgments cannot be made except on very simplistic grounds, such as counting the total number of genes judged inferior and superior. Even this approach falls short because certain single genes can cause far more problems than others, and conversely, can confer on the person more advantages than most other genes, such as genes that result in the production of above average levels of glutathione as transferase. This trait would reduce the likelihood of heart disease from cancer to heart disease to strokes. It then would be necessary to rate each individual gene and gene interaction, something that so far has not been done. In addition, many so-called inferior genes are actually mutations that were caused somewhere in the human genetic past and were subsequently passed on to the victim's offspring. Of the identified diseases, over 5,000 are a result of heritable mutations, and none of these 5,000 existed in our past before the mutation causing it was introduced into the human gene pool. As these mutations accumulate, a deterioration of the genome called devolution results, an event that is the opposite of the eugenics goal of trying to create the most flawless race and then limit reproduction to members of this race. This goal is flawed because the accumulation of mutations tends to result in all races becoming less perfect. And if I just find another part where I can quote someone. I quote, as J.B.S. Haldane proclaimed in 1932, as a society of men that was uniformly perfect would still produce an imperfect society. The enormous genetic variety among humans and among plants and animals as well was important because it will always allow some individuals to survive different environmental changes. When the Pilgrims came over to America, a few had the genetic predispositions that enabled them to survive the alien environment in America, with its foreign germs and new living requirements. Those that survived may not have been the strongest in the land from which they came, but were stronger in the new environment. If all those that came over were genetically identical, likely none of them would have survived. End of quote. So, trying to get rid of all these mutations that cause what you see as diseases, disorders, will take us towards devolution. Let's continue.
Tom Clements, who is autistic himself, wrote in an opinion piece in The Guardian that many now self-identify as autistic as though autism were a fashion label rather than a debilitating disorder, and that such an attitude has led to the marginalization of autistic people who, by virtue of their disability, are unable to speak and rely on others to do so on their behalf.
This is another direct false assumption and lie. Individuals of ASD3 who can type actually do speak on behalf of themselves. They're all over the internet. I've got testimonials by those of ASD3 who said that when they were kids, just big assumptions, false assumptions were made about them. Like, oh, my child's incapable of thought. They can't even have their own opinions. They don't have their own desires. Tons of false assumptions while the children were sitting in the same room. So that's just a false assumption altogether. And the fact it was the intellectually disabled who began the movement, that shows they're an active part of the movement, as they're the ones who actually began it to begin with in the mid-20th century. Let's continue.
Some neurodivergent people have pushed back, pointing out that Clements used the term high functioning to refer to himself, and that such functioning labels should not be used because they suggest some people with ASD do not need help. Others complained that Clements is a very active troll who spends a lot of time misrepresenting the neurodiversity movement, and that he accuses autistic people of not actually being autistic.
Tom Clements certainly does misrepresent the movement. Certainly a lot. Such as where he goes saying that we celebrate. No, the mainstream neurodiversity movement does not celebrate disabilities. It does not go claiming that we're differently abled or specially abled or all this special language. But the disabled community actually protests against all this special language. It's the disabled people who are pushing against it. Neurodiversity advocates. It was politicians and ableist parents who made all these terms like differently abled. It was ableist parents who didn't want to acknowledge the oppression they were committing. So you can't blame all that stuff on us.
Energy supplies don't want you to know about this trick to warm up houses for practically zero cost. This space heat.
I didn't know anything about this when I started.
I didn't know anything about this when I started making this video. So she knew nothing about it. You've seen from how many books I've read and quoted from, and if you look on my other videos, you'll see me quoting from even more books. As I just look around my room right now, here I've got The Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, The Power of Neurodiversity, The Darwin Effect, its influence on Nazism, eugenics, racism, communism, capitalism and sexism, the Autism Industrial Complex, CRISPR, people, eugenics, down there I've got neurodiversity studies, the myth of normal. Yeah, these are thousands of pages of reading that I've done. I've got the neurodiversity reader just here by my side, by Damien Milton. All these, the authors, are members of the science community. So to claim that there's no scientists who support neurodiversity, it's just plain false. Otherwise, why is there tons of authors who are active scientists in the profession promoting neurodiversity? thinking that it should be a new inquiry. So that shows it's just another false assumption. By Sabine.
Started making this video, I was just trying to understand the symptoms of autism and had no idea the topic had become so controversial. But I hope that this rundown helps you make a little sense of what's going on. In summary, autism spectrum disorder is a mental health condition that...
Not mental health condition, a developmental disorder, according to the DSM, but according to the neurodiversity advocates, a developmental disability.
That subsumes what was previously called autism and Asperger's syndrome. It's more common than you might think, affecting more than 1 in 100 people. Most of them are able to live a fairly normal life, but face challenges, especially at work and in social interactions.
No, we don't quite face the challenges in social interactions. It's a two-way street. So it's not just us, it's both.
Many of them prefer to refer to themselves as neurodivergent and try to raise awareness for the challenges they are facing. But the neurodiversity movement has been criticized for trivializing the problems of those most...
No, it's not been trivializing problems. We've actually been trying to solve the problems. For example, looking for more humane interventions to use. Like, if you look through YouTube channels about ABA videos, you'll find lots of autistic people saying, do DIR floor time, use the Skates model, do music therapy. You know, they're giving you other options, but they're saying stop doing ABA. So we are just against specific treatments, like eugenics. We're against that. We're against eugenics and we're against ABA. And we're not the only ones against ABA. Other science disciplines are as well. Even members of WEC for ABA are against ABA. You know, they have their objections, but they're told to just swallow their objections as if it's a cult. Because it is just a business, ABA. And that's why we call for withdrawal funding and to go for better interventions. So no, you're not trivializing problems. That's just another false accusation by those like Tom Clements who like to misrepresent neurodiversity advocates and the neurodiversity movement.
Severely affected. I've been accused several times of being autistic or having Asperger's syndrome. It normally comes after a long list of complaints about how I'm rude and arrogant, talk like a robot, am about as empathetic as a brick and similarly spontaneous, but considerably less social. Luckily, there's an online self-test you can do for this. So let's see how neurodivergent I am. Here we go. Your autism spectrum symptoms are high. I think that's wrong. I'm really just rude or German, but then I repeat myself. What do you think about neurodiversity? Are you autistic yourself or have autistic children? Let us know in the comments. I've often wished I could collect all news on one topic and see where it's been covered.
Clearly, she doesn't wish that. She clearly only spent, well, she said just before making this video. So she probably spent no more than 1 month. I've spent nearly 25 years on disabilities, learning about them. And that's why my channel's about disabilities, especially autism and neurodiversity in general. Because that's what I know about. I'm not, if you say look to the right on the recommendation list of videos, you'll see another one by Sabine Hossenfelder called Is Being Trans a Social Fad Among Teenagers? She doesn't know much about that area either, but there's lots of response videos against that for those who actually are trans, saying she's misrepresenting them. So just like she's misrepresenting trans, she's misrepresenting neurodiversity advocates. Nearly every video she brings up that is not to do with physics. I'm not a physicist, so I can't say anything about a physics videos being wrong. But considering all those who work in the other professions, the fact I see those who work in them, who actually are educated about the subject, point in and correct tons of things as I'm correcting this one. And Nerve actually knows absolutely nothing about the subjects. She clearly either doesn't do enough research or is just being dishonest. The sources that she picks are plain illegitimate and bigotry. That's clearly not good research, not a good way of selecting sources.
And who put what spin on it. And I've now found a way to do exactly this. It's a web news, and they've been sponsoring this video. Ground News is a news platform that provides you with a lot of extra information.
Well, that's the end of that video now. So if any of you ever come across any of Sabine's videos, I strongly recommend that you check out her sources, because the sources I've traced down of hers are illegitimate and are bigotry. For example, some sources she's traced down, she goes making such ridiculous claims, such as she says there's no evidence that puberty blockers prevent the body from changing on that trans video, because I saw someone who knows about things like transgender, transsexual. Yeah. I watched a video about one of them, a response video, and he provided great evidence that Sabine was full of rubbish. And there was someone who's trans herself, and someone called Rebecca, I think she's called, and she did a response video to it, and absolutely provided tons of evidence that Sabine was full of rubbish. So I advise you, if it's not to do with physics, make sure you actually check a sources yourself. Don't take our word for granted. If you found this interesting, I thank you. If you made it this far, please hit like, hit subscribe, and then you'll know when more content is uploaded. Thank you.